I always loved visiting my grandparents' house, especially on holidays. I always looked forward to going there any chance we got, since it was an escape from my often boring life, and my grandparents basically allowed me to do whatever I wanted. Even though it was a sort of vacation spot for me, going to my grandparents also had a way of making me feel isolated and empty. They had a small one-story home in a tiny neighborhood along a country road in northern Michigan. The wide open space felt endless if I found myself staring at the horizon of a field either in our backyard or out of a window for too long. It leaves room in the mind for pondering, particularly during fall or winter. During the summer months there, the trees and vibrant vegetation complements the land in a way I can only describe as magical, inviting a comfort inside of you that would fill the emptiness. But something about the skeletal remains of tall trees on a bleak plain of dried fields sends my thoughts to a place of mystery, sometimes horror. When I turned 8, my parents started fighting a lot. When I turned 9, my mom filed for a divorce. Then next year, I was suddenly going to my grandparents with my dad alone. I had a life split right down the middle and separated into two worlds. My mother's parents were both dead, and I would see my father on the weekends, and on one such weekend right after my 12th birthday, he asked if I wanted to spend Halloween at my grandparents' this year. I agreed immediately. Their separation was definitely something that affected me, but for the age I was, I took it well enough and considered myself a little more mature than a lot of my friends. Halloween was actually very lively in my grandparents' neighborhood. It was one of my favorite holidays, too, and the idea of being out there seemed more fun to me than being alone with my mom doing what she wanted. I love my mother very much, but I was just a kid, and the idea of being with my dad and grandparents seemed more exciting, given that I now had the choice between the two. My dad was also a lot more energetic and always had something for me to do other than watch TV or do my homework when I got home from school. Halloween was on Sunday that year, and we drove out there Friday around 4 p.m. The ride out to my grandparents was an hour and 20 minutes from my dad's new apartment, and it was mostly a pleasant trip through the state, but the cemetery we would pass along the highway always creeped me out. I usually doze off eventually, and would wake up to the sound of tires rolling over my grandparents' gravel driveway. I was thrilled to get out of the car and bounded up to the front door to see my grandparents already opening it to greet me for an embrace. We shared the joy of each other's company for about an hour and then had dinner. Ribeye and vegetables with mashed potatoes and mac and cheese, a meal I particularly enjoyed in my young age and was a family favorite. Even though it was getting dark fast and being the big 12-year-old I was, after dinner I volunteered to take the garbage out to the bins located by the garage. My grandpa reluctantly agreed, so I dutifully went ahead and put myself up to the task. I did the deed and took a moment to look around while I was out by the bins. My grandparents had enough acreage in their backyard to build another house and a motocross track if they wanted to, and my eyes eventually met the now blackened forest that surrounded the property. I smiled to myself as I remembered one year for my 9th birthday party, a group of my cousins and friends played flashlight tag out there. There was an opening in the trees that led down a path my grandpa made years ago. My eyes met the open mouth of pitch black. The darkened gray sky only made that empty feeling I'll get out there amplify the longer I stared into that yawning darkness. Only now an untapped fear was beginning to stir in my chest. The weight from it made me feel uneasy, and I quickly brought myself back inside to my family. As I walked in and shut the back door, I caught the tail end of a conversation my dad seemed to be having with my grandpa. "I'm going outside at night alone after that, okay? Not even in the backyard where it's fenced," was all I managed to hear as I walked through the house into the front room where they were. I asked what they were talking about, but my dad distracted me with one of my favorite games growing up and started setting up Yahtzee for the family to play until it was bedtime. I was one of those kids who liked a TV on to help get restful sleep, so I would usually sleep with my CRT television turned to Channel 25, Cartoon Network. This was in 2001, so I would sometimes wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning to some show on Adult Swim I shouldn't be exposed to. However, at my grandparents' place, there were no televisions in any of the rooms except the front room, and my grandpa always wanted all electronics off after midnight. No exceptions. I didn't particularly mind, but sometimes it was a little difficult to sleep at my grandparents' because of this. On this night, it just so happened that I had a hard time getting to sleep. Something about earlier when I was staring into that darkened opening made my mind wander to places it didn't normally go to, and kept tossing and turning. Eventually, I had to go to the bathroom and I got up with a deep sigh to go take care of my business. The guest room I sleep in is located nearest to the front room, and there was a sliding glass door behind the couch that led to the back patio, where the fenced-in yard was. I have to walk through a small hallway to get to the only bathroom in the house. Before you get to the bathroom door, on your left is the front room with the sliding glass door displaying the backyard and forest beyond. As soon as you get out of the bathroom, the only thing in front of you is the front room with a perfect angle of the glass door, directly showing that opening in the woods. I made my way to the bathroom and did my best to make things quick and to not make too much noise to wake my family. After I finished up, I thought about closing my eyes and just hurtling to my room, but I didn't want to risk bumping into something in my blind attempt at getting back into bed. As I said, once you open that bathroom door, you pretty much have no choice but to face the back patio glass door. And the moment my eyes met that opening, I noticed movement to the far right of it. A shape made itself known, and my brain registered a silhouette illuminated by moonlight. It was a person, a man. His clothes were dark, but the shape of a person is what stood out. When I looked at the digital clock above the kitchen stove and confirmed it was 3:47 in the morning, I was disturbed to realize that some person would just be out there right now. I was frozen. My limbs were weighted in stone, and I felt another stir in my chest similar to that emptiness, but far worse. He disappeared into the forest, and I was left with my thoughts reeling. The most alarming was my 12-year-old brain wondering how someone wouldn't be frightened to walk around out there at a time like this. That thought alone conjured up all manner of nightmares. What if it was a ghost, a zombie? Why would any normal person be out there right now? My parents and teachers have explained that monsters are just made up for the thrill and fascination with the dark and grim. It's fiction. For entertainment purposes only. What I was seeing was a walking, breathing human being doing something my young mind thought only monsters and ghosts were supposed to do. But this wasn't entertaining, it was terrifying. Not only was there a random man walking around in the woods at almost 4 in the morning, but he was wandering around the border of my grandparents' property. There was a feature about the man that really stood out, though. It was his head. With the sudden glimpse I caught of the man in the darkness, I could make out the size and shape of the head. It was disproportionate to the rest of his body. Too large, round, and orange for any normal person to have. I couldn't help but think that it sort of looked like a pumpkin. I didn't want to wake anyone up, but I really wanted to go in the room where my dad slept to tell him what I saw and bunk with him. I decided against it though, as I didn't want to appear too childish to my dad. I'm sure he would be annoyed and dismiss it as some nightmare I had. I eventually got some sleep after some fearful fits of tossing and turning, and my family let me sleep in until a little after noon that Saturday. I was grateful, because we had a very busy day that day. My grandpa informed us it was going to rain later that night, and the front and backyards needed to be cleaned up. I was tasked with raking the leaves while my dad cleaned the gutters. I was also specifically told that if a pile of leaves somehow gets made and I'm found jumping in one of them, I'll get to fall asleep in the front room with the TV on all night if I so pleased. It's a silly way of rewarding me for raking the leaves, but that's just how my grandma was. and my grandpa seemed to be okay with breaking his no exceptions policy. My dad just smiled at me. Mixed with the work and feeling excited about the next few hours and Halloween, I had nearly forgotten about what I saw last night. When I did look at the forest, I quickly dismissed the idea that there was a man with a pumpkin head out there, figuring the vision was just my imagination running wild due to it approaching Halloween. And eventually, I heard the distant rumble of thunder signify the approaching thunderstorms. Once the tasks were done, the rain began coming down and we made our way inside to get prepared for dinner. My grandma said she wasn't feeling all that well today and didn't feel like cooking, and my grandpa decided that a pizza delivery from the nearby town wouldn't be a bad idea if we all decided that was an appropriate dinner. I personally love good pizza, and the rest of my family decided on getting Hungry Howie's delivered. It was nice knowing the establishment would still deliver to my grandparents even though it was outside of their usual route zone. The town was only a 10-minute drive, and my grandpa has worked doing trucking and logistics all over Michigan before he retired. His work over the course of time has put him in many business owners' good graces, and I picked up on this in my young age listening to my grandpa's stories. We ate our pizza and eventually all settled to our respective sleeping arrangements, and I looked forward to watching cartoons while I geared myself for bed. My grandparents' couch was rather comfortable, and I found it easy to get in a good spot to eventually doze off. But before that, I went to the fridge to get another slice of leftover pizza. It was a little after midnight. The rain was only a light patter on the windows, and I figured another hour of TV and a slice of pizza wasn't a bad idea. I could hear the occasional hum of distant thunder, and I made sure the volume wasn't too high for my family's sake. I took a deep breath of relief and contentment. I've always liked staying up a little late and enjoyed this little window of solitude at my grandparents'. It really did seem like a sort of vacation, as I had previously mentioned. This made me giddy, and I remembered having a fit of excitement while I waited for the pizza to heat up. I opened the microwave before the countdown hit 0 and got my food out. When I closed the microwave, I heard a noise coming from the front room over the low volume of some infomercial. My excitement was immediately replaced with panic and fear. It was tapping, a set of deliberate taps on a glass surface. I remained still, petrified in my grandparents' kitchen, holding a plate of microwave pizza and a glass of chocolate milk in my hands. Tapping continued for a moment before it suddenly stopped. I entertained the idea that it was just some noise the house made. Maybe the house was settling, or it was just wind moving the flimsy panes of glass that separated me from the dark approaching storm, and whatever else could be out there. Sweat began to form on my temples and back. I tried to vocalize something, but in that moment of petrified silence, all that came out were whispers and whimpers of a plea. I didn't know what I was supposed to do then, but a voice in my head told me to just turn around. When I finally did, that man I saw last night was there, staring at me through the sliding glass door, a carved pumpkin over his head and wearing it like a Halloween mask. The television light illuminated his eyes through the carved shape. The look he had was enough to cause my legs to buckle. Gradually, I noticed more horrifying details about this man as I stared in horror. Not only was the man nearly as tall as the 8-foot length of the glass door and towered over my father, but he wasn't wearing any clothes this time. Only I quickly became aware that his skin was incredibly loose and seemed like it sagged off his body in certain areas. My brain had a hard time processing this image. It didn't look like the skin was even his own because I noticed clear stitch marks across the chest, abdomen, and legs like some ill-fitted jumpsuit made of other people's skin. I noticed something in his left hand, some kind of sack, and I could see what looked like a tuft of blonde hair sticking out from the opening. The jack-o'-lantern had tilted to one side, and he waved. I reeled backwards, screaming, falling on the floor, dropping my pizza and chocolate milk, wailing in total shock and fear. It was loud enough to wake my family, obviously, and the monster from the other side of the glass took off and darted into the night. A loud boom of thunder crashed from outside, and the rain started coming down even harder. For the remainder of that night, I spent it with my dad in his room, but I didn't get a wink of sleep. Of course, my dad chalked up my claims of seeing a man with a pumpkin for a head wearing other people's skin as a nightmare. But the way my grandpa looked at me when I explained what I saw seemed to make him age another 10 years. Needless to say, my Halloween was ruined. While I was trick-or-treating, every jack-o'-lantern set me into a panic. All I could visualize was that man staring back at me through the harmless Halloween decor or costumes that surrounded me while I walked door to door for candy. At this point, I just really wanted to be with my mom, and I asked my dad if we could leave early that night. My dad started to get worried then, and immediately started questioning me about last night. When we got back to my grandparents, we all had a meeting in the front room before I gathered all of my things. I explained to them what I saw in detail, and with a lot less panic this time. My grandpa cleared his throat before asking my dad if it would be alright to say something that might scare me even more, but that it was important. My dad looked at me with a stern expression, and I nodded. I feel I had already seen enough to put some grit into me. We all sat in silence then, waiting for my grandpa to tell us what was on his mind. It was something that made us call the police right after he explained himself. He was watching the news just a few days before we arrived. There was a story about a serial killer on the loose, seemingly targeting individuals at random and all through the states, never staying in one place. The killer was leaving the bodies on display in places for the police, completely skinned, and they were always found on Halloween. It was usually older men and women. The reports said that this has only been going on for a couple of years, but the gruesome state of the deceased was enough to send local police and townsfolk into hysteria. Another shocking detail of the killer's corpse display was a jack-o'-lantern fitted over the victim's head. The murders were dubbed the Pumpkinhead Murders. The realization hit me. That had to be him out there, watching me and waving, wearing the skin of another one of his victims. After the police came and questioned me, we went back to my mom's, and she actually allowed my dad to stay on the couch at our old house for me. The police from my grandparents' town asked my local PD to keep a unit outside of my mom's until morning. I couldn't look at a jack-o'-lantern the same after that, and I didn't want to visit my grandparents for a while. I went to therapy for years, and it seemed to help all the way into my teens, and I eventually went to college. The events from that night were nothing more than a passing thought now. It still lingered, but it wasn't something that caused me to stir in nervousness anymore. But that brings me to why I'm telling you this. Halloween is tomorrow, and I am currently sitting in my office, recording this while my wife and daughter are in the kitchen getting our Halloween plans together. We are going to carve pumpkins tonight and obviously go trick-or-treating tomorrow. For some reason, call it morbid curiosity, I decided to dig up records of the serial killer that I had seen all those years ago at my grandparents'. What I found was concerning. I was relieved to see, however, that he was caught in northern Minnesota on May 23rd in 2006. His name was Richard Dawson, and he worked for some trucking company. In 2001, the year I went to my grandparents on Halloween, there was, of course, another victim. Only this time it wasn't his usual MO. An 11-year-old girl was found dead and completely skinned. She was left in some woods just outside the county highway located not but a mile and a half down the road from my grandparents. She was missing her head. The report I read included that he had her head displayed as a trophy in his home located in Iowa, which was dubbed by officials as a house of horrors due to the sheer amount of corpses and pieces of victims hung up on display all over the interior. Skin suits stitched together were hung up in his bedroom closet. The poor little girl's head sat atop his nightstand. She had blonde hair. He was staring at me through that glass door, a 12-year-old boy with her head in his sack. Hold your loved ones close. Protect your families. Because some Halloween monsters could actually be very, very real. I awoke to something dry and bristly rubbing against my face. Tilled earth and fertilizer filled my nose as I lied on the ground, face pointed toward the sky. A wave of rustling echoed in my mind as a cool breeze flowed over my face. My eyes struggled to open, matted from a heavy sleep, I guess you'd call it. Turning my head side to side, all I saw were endless rows of corn. The tops of the brown, crisp stalks bobbed lazily in the light wind. Their dry leaves brushed against each other, making a sound like dry skin catching on cheap linen. My head swam. It felt like a hangover, but I knew I didn't drink enough to cause that. 3 or 4 beers at most. Maybe someone put something in my drink. It's the only thing that makes sense. I pushed myself unsteadily to my feet. My vision doubled and refocused. A clawing pain ripped through my stomach as though I hadn't eaten in weeks. It was a sickening mixture of starvation and nausea. The rancid taste of vomit filled my mouth. Shoving my hands into my pockets, I was concerned to discover that whoever had dumped me here had taken my cell phone. My wallet was missing too. The only things left in my pockets were a half-crushed pack of cigarettes and a lighter. Looking to the ground, I saw the remains of my meal, congealed and soaking in the loamy soil. Sitting next to it, looking into the moon-filled sky, was a silicone Halloween mask. The skeleton face framed in a ratty white whaler's beard smiled up at me. "Funny meeting you here," the mask seemed to say. I nervously chuckled as the thought bounced inside of my head. "Yeah," I said to the mask. "Pretty wild." My mind was foggy, but I could remember a few details from earlier in the night before I woke up alone in the cornfield. Marcus Hart, my roommate, told me one of the fraternities on campus had planned a Halloween kegger at someone's cabin. A girl Marcus was chasing after mentioned that she would be there, and Marcus dragged me along. Marcus and I weren't outcasts by any means, but we weren't hanging with the popular people on campus. Friendly, sure, but party invitations weren't filling up our mailbox. The entire concept of a frat party seemed a little off-putting, but I hated to make him go alone. "I think Stacy's into me, Danny," Marcus said as my Acura rumbled down the country road. I was going to the party as a favor to him, so he had the pleasure of driving us. "Seems like a good signal that she told me about the Halloween party tonight." "She didn't exactly invite us." I chuckled as I took a drag off my cigarette. A crisp autumn breeze was blowing in through the crack in the window, blowing ashes wildly through the cab of the car. "She didn't exactly volunteer the information. Didn't you ask her if she had plans?" Marcus took a hand from the wheel and extended his middle finger in my direction. I chortled again as I flicked the smoldering butt out the window. It bounced off the mile marker sign, exploding into a cloud of red cinders. "She could have just told you she was busy, and it seemed like she was pretty happy when you said you would stop by. Relax. It'll be a fun night." Marcus smiled at my response. "But let's not stick around too long," I said. "Frat guys are a bunch of assholes, and I'm not looking to spend the whole night with them drinking cheap beer and watching them, I don't know, show their ass." "They aren't all bad," Marcus responded. "I have some classes with a few of them. Decent enough guys." I rolled my eyes and lit another cigarette. "I don't know what high school was like for you," I replied snidely. "For me, those are the guys that gave me hell all the time. Being in a frat is for rich kids who want to buy friends, not my kind of scene." We drove on in silence. I guess I offended him, but it was how I felt. Not everyone in a fraternity was a bad guy, most likely, but it seemed like an accurate stereotype to me. After what felt like an eternity of winding down two-lane country roads, the GPS on my phone alerted us that the house was ahead on the left. As we rounded the final corner, we could see smoke rising from a bonfire by the edge of a cornfield. Loud music blasted through the air as nearly 100 college students milled about. We parked in the field across the road and headed over to the thriving party. After grabbing a few beers and making laps to see if we knew anyone there, we settled toward the edge of the costumed horde and watched the chaos. Marcus looked frantically through the crowd trying to spot Stacy. "Did you see her anywhere?" he asked, slight panic in his voice. "Everyone at this damn party has a mask on. I'm not sure I'd recognize her in one." I shrugged. He had a point. She would blend into the crowd. "I think I'm gonna make another pass and see if I can spot her," he said. "Gonna come?" "You go ahead," I said, pulling a pack of cigarettes from my shirt pocket. "I'm gonna step off to the side for a smoke." Marcus tossed me a wave and headed off into the crowd, scanning the shifting cluster for Stacy. I walked a few feet away from that cluster of people to save them from the cloud of cigarette smoke. Just because I was destroying my lungs didn't mean they had to suffer the secondhand effects. I lit my cigarette and turned to look out at the immense cornfield. A long draw of smoke was drifting into my lungs when a heavy hand fell on my shoulder. It startled me and I choked as my body ejected my last draw. Body shaking with tremors from my deep coughs, I turned to see a shirtless man wearing a monstrous jester mask. "You're breaking the rules," the demonic harlequin shouted. In his hands, he held a floppy Halloween mask and a red plastic cup filled with beer. "If you want to stay at this party, you have to wear a mask and you have to drink some beer." He shoved the mask and cup into my hands. Turning the mask over in my hand, I saw the smiling skeletal face framed in the white whaler's beard. The hollow socket seemed to look into my eyes. I had worn dozens of masks in my life, but something about this one made me uneasy. I couldn't explain it. Taking a long swig from the red cup of beer, I held the bearded skeleton mask out toward the man in the jester mask. He tilted his head to the side to express his confusion. I smiled at him and gestured towards the mask. "Not my style," I replied as politely as I could. "I'll have a few beers, but I'll pass on the borrowed mask. Sounds like an awesome way to catch COVID." "I don't think you understand," said the jester in a now booming and different voice. He pushed the mask back toward my chest. I could see over his shoulder that the outer rim of the crowd had fallen silent. Dozens of masked faces turned toward us and watched our exchange. A few of the larger guys donning floppy masks and fraternity shirts stepped out of the crowd and began to walk toward us. "Wear the mask or get out of here. Are you too good for my mask?" My eyes scanned the line of large men marching toward us. Some of them dropped their cups to the ground and clenched their fists, veins bulging under their skin. Others cracked their necks side to side as they approached. More and more of the crowd behind them turned to watch us. I tossed the beer back nervously and smiled in an attempt to calm the situation. Reaching out, I grabbed the mask and stretched it over my head. The inside of it smelled like a medical glove, and the large frame caused it to shift randomly in front of my eyes. The world looked like a claymation movie as the scene before me came in and out of view. The line of fraternity guys stopped and eased their posture. Most of the crowd began to turn away and started dancing again. The jester patted me on the shoulder and laughed loudly. "That's the spirit," he howled, back in his jester voice. "Let's get you another beer." He put his hand on my back and guided me toward the crowd and waved his hand. A young woman wearing a terrifyingly realistic zombie mask darted forward. She shoved another beer into my hand as the jester began chanting for me to chug. Soon, the crowd nearest to us joined in. Feeling a mixture of peer pressure and exhilaration, I pulled the chin of the skeleton mask over my mouth and tipped the beer back. Long waves of beer poured down my throat, leaving a metallic taste in my mouth, almost like it had sat in the keg too long. I wanted to spit it out, but I was afraid of how the jester might react. Cheers erupted from the crowd of dancing college kids. Their masks bounced and contorted unnaturally as they moved. My stomach churned as it tried to settle the sudden flood of beer. My vision blurred. "Just one more," said a man dressed as a gorilla, shoving another beer into my hand. "Just one more and you'll be in the spirit of things." I once more tipped the beer back and the crowd roared with delight. That's the last thing I remember before waking up in the corn. They must have drugged me. My head throbbed as the rustling of the corn waxed and waned. Bright moonlight washed over the field, casting the faintest of shadows as it passed through the stalks. I looked at my watch and saw it was nearly midnight. Marcus and I arrived at the party around 7 that night. Couldn't have been longer than an hour before I had funneled the 3 drugged beers, so I had been out in the field for at least 4 hours. Unsure of what to do, I decided to try and make my way out of the field. There were no landmarks available, so I started walking through the rows of corn. The stalks towered overhead, unusually tall. I had no view of the field at all. I even tried to jump a few times, but the massive wall of vegetation was too high to see over. In the distance, I could see that the row of corn appeared to come to an end. Most of my life had been spent living in a mid-sized city, and I didn't know much about farming, but I knew it was odd. Corn was planted in neat rows. A nervous bubbling grew in my stomach as I grew closer to the end of the row. When I was a few feet from the end, I saw that the row didn't end. There was a 90-degree right turn. I went around the bend to see another turn about 20 feet ahead of me, leading to the left. It wasn't a damn cornfield. It was a maze. In my frustration, I sat on the ground and began to run my hands through my hair. Panicked thoughts raced through my head as I tried to figure out what the hell was going on. None of it made any sense. The fraternity hosting the party had drugged my drinks. But why? Was it some kind of hazing ritual? No, that wouldn't make sense. I hadn't pledged to any fraternities, and I wasn't popular enough to be approached by one directly. Was it a practical joke? Probably. But what the hell was the point? None of those guys even knew me. Regardless of why they drugged me and dumped me in the middle of some stupid maze, I was terrified. The corn was unnaturally tall, and the rustling noise produced by the wind in the plants made me feel like something was moving through them. Watching me. Hunting me, even. Some ancient sense filled my body with the dread that something was stalking me. And then I heard a voice.
Found your mask back where we left you.
It shouted from a few rows away.
I thought you knew the rules. Gotta leave your mask on. Don't worry, I'll bring it to you. Just hold tight. We have to punish you for breaking the rules, though.
Heavy footsteps began to mingle with the rustling of the dry corn.
It'll hurt, but I'll try to make it quick.
Bolts of panic filled my body, and I jumped from the ground and began to run in the direction that I had come. My body weight was trending forward, causing me to fall to the ground before regaining my feet and running as quickly as I could.
Over here,
shouted the voice I assumed belonged to the jester.
He's running back to where we left him. No cheating pledges. Stay in the maze. Anyone caught running through the rows will be punished.
Dozens of footsteps filled the air now, like a demonic herd of cattle moving through the field. Brief glimpses of masked faces appeared and vanished rapidly in the rows beside me. Some of them were so close I could hear their ragged hot breath billowing inside of their rubber masks. Their hands reached out, slapping the dry stalks of corn. It created a deafening web of noise all around me. I couldn't tell if I was surrounded, but the symphony of terrifying sounds at least gave me that impression.
Only one pledge spot to fill this year, boys,
came the voice of the jester.
Whoever brings me his ears will join our brotherhood.
A chorus of laughter broke out around me in response to the macabre order. There was a boiling sensation of fear and anger in my stomach as my feet hammered to the ground. Pushing me back toward the clearing where I had woken up, I had no plan, operating off of pure fear and adrenaline. As I neared the end of the row into the clearing where I had woken, I saw the jester standing with his back turned away from me. In his left hand, I saw the skeleton mask, and in his right, he held a long-bladed knife. In a mixture of terror and rage, I barreled toward him and tackled him to the ground. The knife and mask tumbled to the ground as we slammed to the earth with a sickening thud. His head smacked heavily against a rock protruding from the ground. A gust of air and whimper burst from the jester's mouth as I landed on top of him. Unsure if he was still conscious, I pushed myself up from the ground and grabbed the knife. Turning back toward him, I pointed the knife in his direction. At first, I thought he was dead, until I saw his back rise and fall, taking shallow breaths. I inched toward him, knife still outstretched, ready for him to attack. He never moved. Kneeling, I settled my knee into the center of his back. He groaned in pain but remained in place. Slowly, I tugged the jester mask off his head. His face was a ruin of fractures and lacerations from his fall on the rock. Dark red blood traced through his messy mop of blonde hair. His glazed eyes twitched and struggled to focus on mine. "You better. He coughed, and a spray of blood and phlegm peppered the ground in front of his mouth. "Better run, man. They won't stop." I could still hear footfalls in the distance and the whisper of the cornstalks. They would be here soon, and I knew I had to move. I needed to slow them down, buy me some time. Then I saw the discarded skeleton mask. Everyone at the party had seen me wearing it. Maybe it would throw them off. I grabbed the crumpled mask and tugged it over the blonde man's head. He fought weakly against me, but I was able to get it onto him without much trouble. After I placed it on his head, I grabbed his jester mask and put it on. It was disgusting, but maybe they would recognize the mask and think I was one of them. The smell inside nearly made me vomit again. Sweat and the thick scent of copper overwhelmed me. Warm, sticky fluid made the rubber cling to my face, a mixture of the jester's blood and sweat, no doubt. Voices behind me began to grow loud, and the sound of hands brushing against the rows of corn swelled. They were getting closer. I had to leave and hope that the man wearing my mask would slow them down. At first, I considered bursting through the rows of corn to run in a straight line, but thought better of it quickly. The noise would be immense and alert them to my location instantly. Even if they didn't hear me breaking through the dry stalks, the visible path I would leave behind would provide them with a direct path to track me. I moved toward one of the rows of corn and carefully pushed 2 of them aside, leaving enough room for me to slide through. Carefully, I lifted one leg and sat it down on the other side of the row. Once I had solid footing, I brought my second foot and gently released the 2 stalks I was holding, allowing them to lazily bounce back into place. I performed the same separation and moved on to the second row of corn, leaving 2 rows between myself and the jester's battered body. I hoped the group would find him and be satisfied that it was me on the ground, but there was no way to be sure. If they discovered that it was their friend on the ground, I had no way to be sure they wouldn't ignore the rules and burst through the maze walls to search for me directly.
There he is!
I heard a voice shout in the distance. It sounded hauntingly familiar, but in my panic I couldn't figure out where I had heard him before. At the party, most likely.
He's on the ground. His ears are mine.
Between the rows of stalks, I could see a young man wearing a werewolf mask run toward the body. The jester, now wearing my skull mask, pushed himself onto his back and held up his shaking hands toward the approaching man. He stood over the broken man and pulled a knife from his belt.
Put your hands down and take it like a man,
the werewolf said and kicked the jester in the ribs. A loud crunch exploded from his side as a high-pitched whine escaped the mask.
I'm just taking your ears. Sit still and I'll cut them clean off. Won't even hurt. That much. You may even make it to the main road before you bleed to death.
The werewolf kneeled and reached his hand toward the top of the skeleton mask. I had been transfixed by the events. But suddenly I realized my half-clever diversion was being wasted as I watched them. Moving as quietly and quickly as I could, I began to slip carefully between the rows. All the while, I prayed I was moving closer to the edge of the field instead of farther in.
Guys,
shouted the werewolf.
It's Brandon. The son of a bitch hurt him. I think it looks like he smashed his head on a rock and broke his ribs.
Asshole, I thought to myself as I pushed through the corn. I busted his head up, but you broke his ribs. I almost chuckled to myself at the thought, half maddened as I was. Footfalls sounded behind me as the cluster of psychotic pledges pounded through the field looking for me. My heart thundered against my chest as I continued to quietly slide between the rows of corn one at a time. With each successful pass, the sound of the mob grew a bit quieter. Even with their leader killed or out of commission, they seemed dedicated to holding to their rule of not breaking through the corn maze walls. It was a relief, but I still doubted I would be able to move out of the field quickly enough to escape them. Even if I did, there was no telling how far I was from my car. Even if I found it, Marcus had the keys. In the distance, I thought I could hear the sound of cars. My heart filled with hope, and I began to move a bit more quickly toward the noise. For a moment, I had hope I would escape. Suddenly, there was a sound of snapping corn stalks behind me. I looked over my shoulder to see glimpses of the werewolf mask bounding after me through the rows of corn. He was alone and must have assumed the other pledges wouldn't see him. My reliance on them sticking to their own rules had failed. "I see you," he whispered as he pushed through the corn. That same familiar voice scratched at my ears. "Stop running and this can all be over." I began to run faster through the rows. Leaves and corn cobs smacked against my face. He was gaining on me. His footfalls were near behind me. My mind raced between turning to fight and continuing my failing escape attempt.
"It's done, Danny,"
he shouted.
"It'll be so much easier if you would just give in. All I need are your ears."
Danny. He called me Danny. The werewolf knew me. I stopped and spun around to face him. The jester's knife was still clutched in my hand, and I held it toward the werewolf. He stopped in place and held out his knife toward me.
Marcus?
I asked between gulping breaths.
Marcus? What the hell, Marcus?
The werewolf grabbed the tuft of hair on top of the mask and pulled it off. Before me in the cornfield stood my best friend, Marcus. A hateful smirk curled his lip. His hair was matted to his head with sweat, and his eyes were full of madness. But it was him. I pulled off the stolen jester mask and stared in bewilderment at Marcus.
Sorry, buddy,
he said calmly.
I hate that it had to be you. Why are you doing this?
I said, holding back my desire to scream. It would have only attracted the rest of the murderous pledges.
You don't have to go through with this. We're... Shit. I thought we were friends.
Marcus lifted his free hand and wiped the streams of sweat away from his face. You could see the moisture evaporate from his skin in the cool night air. His smirk faded away and turned into a determined glare.
I'm tired of being nobody,
he said flatly.
Being a face in the crowd at a party doesn't bother most people, but I've spent too much of my life being ignored. I pledged the frat but didn't tell you. I knew you wouldn't support it. You think you're better than them. You think you're better than me. Marcus, I'm sorry,
I muttered. He was inching toward me and I walked backward, catching my feet on the stalks and stumbling.
You're not like them. This isn't you. Let's get out of here. We'll get you some help. We can...
Before I could finish my sentence, my shoe tangled in a half-bent stalk of corn and I tumbled onto my back. The air rushed out of my lungs and bright white stars shot across my field of vision. I couldn't see him, but I heard Marcus say something under his breath and the sound of his feet hitting the ground as he began to run toward me. I held the knife out in front of me as my vision steadied, just in time to see Marcus. He was running toward me, knife above his head, preparing to plunge it into me as I lay helplessly on the ground. This is it, I thought. Killed in a damn corn maze. Marcus was just above me, swinging the knife in a high arc when I made my final desperate move. I picked up my right leg and drove it into his knee. The joint hyperextended, angled in the wrong direction. He fell to the ground shrieking in pain. The knife flew from his hand and into the row behind us. His howls of misery filled the air. I knew it would draw the rest of the pack. They were far enough away that it would be difficult for them to figure out where we were immediately. But I knew if it continued, they would find us in a matter of moments. At that moment, I did the worst thing I had ever done. The worst thing I ever would do. I placed the knife to his neck and ran the blade from ear to ear. His cries and bellows ceased immediately. Dark crimson blood began to pour from the wound, bubbling as he attempted to speak. He reached for me and took a hold of my sleeve, but I slapped his weak hand away. As I stood to leave, he reached a hand toward me, gesturing for help. I looked into his eyes. The madness was gone. It was Marcus again, my best friend. He was dying, and I had dealt the killing blow. Only moments later, his hand went limp and fell to the ground. Hot tears streamed down my face and bile rolled in my stomach. I had to get out of there. I needed help. I wanted to survive. The field was mostly quiet again. A cool breeze picked up and began to rustle through the corn. The dry leaves crackled and scraped against each other. In the distance, I heard the horde yelling again. They weren't close yet, but they would be soon. My mind was still hazy from the drugs, and I was struggling to recover from having the air knocked out of me. All of my energy had been exerted during my escape attempt from Marcus. My tank was empty. I had killed my friend. The pack of pledges would find me soon. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crushed pack of cigarettes and a lighter. If I was going to die, I thought I should have one last smoke. Soothe my nerves and enjoy one final thing before I went. Placing the bent cigarette in my mouth, I cupped the end of the lighter and put the flame on the tip of my cigarette. As I was taking a drag to keep it lit, a cornstalk bent in the breeze and pushed a dried leaf into the flame of my lighter. It began to ignite rapidly. In a panic, I swatted at the burning stalk and smothered the fire. The smoke and light would lead them right to me. There was no need to draw attention to me anymore quickly. Besides, it would ignite the entire field. That was it. Set the field on fire. Trap them inside. Cigarette dangling from my mouth, I placed the lighter on one of the dry stalks in front of me and sparked the flint. A tiny flame danced from the end of the lighter and spread across the dry leaves. It leapt from stalk to stalk in a matter of moments. I passed through the row of corn behind me and set 2 more stalks ablaze. Just like the first round, the tightly packed stalks of corn passed the flames between each other like cancer. The immense light illuminated the night. As I passed through the 3rd row, I set a final blaze before turning to run toward the sounds of the road. I must have run through the seemingly endless rows for 10 minutes before I finally hit the edge. A wide-open field spread in front of me, and beyond it sat the country road that had carried me and my best friend to this ill-fated party. I turned toward the cornfield a final time before I collapsed to the ground. What had been only a few small fires when I left had turned into an enormous blaze. The flames licked toward the night sky, dancing like spirits against the dark backdrop. Over the crackles of the blaze, I could hear screaming.